right, let's dive into a really fascinating case. A real blend of history and mystery and tragedy. The assassination of His Holiness, Mar Eshai Shimun.
Yeah, this one's a heavy one.
Definitely. And you know what makes this deep dive extra interesting?
What's that?
The source material you provided. We're talking about actual court transcripts from the 1975 trial.
Oh, wow, the trial of David Malik Ismail, the man accused of killing the patriarch.
The one and only.
Those transcripts are a goldmine. They give us a window into, well, not just the events, but also like the tensions brewing in the Assyrian community back then.
Because this wasn't just any murder, right? We're talking about the head of the Assyrian Church of the East, a hugely important religious and cultural figure.
Absolutely. And I mean, think about it. For some people, he was almost like a Christ-like figure.
Exactly. So to have him murdered here in the U.S., in his own home in San Jose.
It sent shockwaves through the whole Assyrian diaspora.
Big time. So what we're going to do is use these transcripts, walk through everything step by step, and see if we can figure out not just what happened that night in November 1975, but why.
The why is always the hardest part.
Absolutely. Okay, let's set the scene. November 6th, 1975, evening in San Jose. The patriarch is at home.
And then gunshots.
And the autopsy report, what did it say?
Grim stuff.
Yeah.
Done by Dr. Mason, the assistant medical examiner. 3 shots. Chest, abdomen, 1 exiting through the right shoulder.
So not just one shot, multiple.
Right. And the angle, it suggests a downward angle. Plus, no gunpowder residue, meaning the shots were fired from at least a couple of feet away.
So no close-range struggle. This was planned.
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about David Malik Ismail, the man accused of this. What's his connection to the patriarch?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. Ismail's father, Malik Yaqub,
Yeah.
he was very close to the patriarch. They were friends, allies, going way back.
But I'm guessing the relationship between the patriarch and David wasn't so rosy.
Completely different story.
And these transcripts, they lay out Ismail's movements before the assassination. Flies into San Francisco from Canada on October 30th using the alias David Benjamin at the Sunset Motel.
That's right.
And then what? What happens during that week?
It's a week of, well, kind of shadowy encounters, lots of conflicting stories. He's going back and forth between San Francisco and San Jose, meeting with people who become key players in the trial.
I bet there are some names that really pop out in these transcripts.
2, especially, Kitty Benjamin and Yul Lazar.
Let's start with Kitty Benjamin.
So she's an acquaintance of Ismail's. She helps him find a place in San Francisco.
And Yul Lazar.
He was the controller at the PSA hotel where Ismail ended up. And, get this, he was also the head of the Assyrian Universal Alliance in San Francisco, the AUA.
Okay, I remember reading something about the AUA in the transcripts. There was some tension between them and the patriarch.
Right. Big tension. They were a political organization, and they wanted a separate Assyrian nation within Iraq.
So that put them at odds with the patriarch, who had a different view. More cautious, maybe.
Right. He was worried that kind of move could backfire, put Assyrians living in Iraq in more danger.
So already we have a potential source of conflict.
Hmm.
Is it possible Ismail was working for the AUA, driven by their agenda?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But before we jump to conclusions, let's talk about the murder weapon.
Okay, let's hear it. What do we know about the gun?
.22 caliber pistol.
Hmm?
According to a guy named Ronnie Myers, he sold that pistol, get this, for $20.
$20?
Yep. In a bar, no less.
Wait, a bar. That's sketchy.
Super sketchy. And it gets even sketchier. Myers testified that he got the gun, originally, from Yul Lazar. Remember him?
The AUA guy in San Francisco.
That's the one.
Hold on. So we have the accused assassin connected to the head of a group who, let's be honest, weren't the patriarch's biggest fans, and the murder weapon might also link back to this same guy. This is starting to sound like a conspiracy theory.
It's got all the elements, right?
It does. So what about Ismail's movements on the day of the murder?
Well, a taxi driver, Monty Beeman, he testified that he picked up Ismail from the Oasis Motel in San Jose.
Okay.
And he drove him, at Ismail's request, to a spot near the patriarch's house on Woosley Street.
And Beeman remembered all this clearly.
Oh, yeah. He even described Ismail's demeanor calm, cool, collected, no signs of being drunk or under pressure, like eerily calm, actually.
So we have Ismail near the patriarch's house just before the murder, but how did he even know where to go? How did he get the address?
That's what the prosecution couldn't quite figure out. Remember, he's using a fake name. His known connections are in San Francisco.
That's a good question. So let's switch gears a bit. What was Ismail's defense? How did his lawyers try to explain all this?
Their argument was that the murder wasn't planned. It was more of a spur-of-the-moment thing, triggered by, well, let's say some deep emotional
Yeah.
issues. They pointed to the rocky relationship between Ismail and the patriarch.
Okay, so some bad blood there.
Yeah, and there were rumors that the patriarch had insulted Ismail's father, who was dead at this point. They argued this simmering resentment might have pushed him over the edge.
So painting a picture of a guy who just snapped, did they have anything to back this up?
They brought in two psychiatrists, Dr. Rappaport and Dr. Nadler.
Big guns.
Right. Both had evaluated Ismail. And their testimonies, they focused on his mental state, hinted at possible brain damage, blackouts, amnesia.
Are we saying he might not have even remembered killing the patriarch?
That's what the defense was implying. These blackouts, maybe made worse by alcohol, plus the potential brain damage.
A recipe for disaster, maybe.
Exactly. So they argued he might not have been in control of his actions.
So on one side, we have the prosecution building a case around conspiracy, premeditation. And on the other, the defense is saying it was an impulsive act driven by a fragile mental state. Two very different stories.
Two sides of the same coin, I guess.
And the jury had to decide which story they believed. What was their verdict? Wow, they didn't buy the whole mentally unstable, acted in the heat of the moment argument.
David Malik Ismail, guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison. Seems pretty open and shut, right?
You're going to tell me it's not, aren't you?
Oh, there's a twist! Despite the life sentence, he was later released because of a mental disability plea. How that happened, well, that's a story for part 2.
All right, so we're back, and I gotta say, I'm still kind of hung up on that last part. Convicted of murder, but then released. It doesn't add up.
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher. Mental disability plea. It's like, how did that even happen?
Exactly. So to figure this out, we got to go back to those transcripts, specifically those conflicting testimonies we were talking about.
Right, because there was a lot of, let's say, discrepancies in what people were saying, especially Kitty Benjamin and Yul Lazar.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that a little more.
Let's start with Kitty Benjamin, the woman who helped Ismail find a place to stay in San Francisco.
Right.
Her testimony, she's adamant that their friendship was purely platonic, never talked about the patriarch, no politics, nothing like that.
But didn't Yul Lazar say something completely different?
Totally different story. Remember, he's the controller at the PSA Hotel and the head of the AUA in San Francisco. He claims he gave Ismail a discount because they were both Assyrian, like a bonding thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he even says they spent a lot of time together, going to church, talking business, even chatting about the patriarch.
But Lazar denied any involvement in the murder, right? He said he didn't know anything about the gun.
Oh, he did. But the prosecution, they were smart. They started poking holes in his story.
Like how?
They brought up the fact that Ronnie Myers, the guy who sold the murder weapon, he pointed the finger right at Lazar, said he was the one who gave him the gun in the first place.
Oh, so now Lazar's credibility is shot.
Pretty much. And then there's that whole thing with the late-night visitors to Ismail's motel room.
Oh, yeah, that was weird. Two guys in a government car showing up at midnight? What was that about?
Yeah. Exactly. It's suspicious, right? And the prosecution jumped all over that. They said it had to be something shady, maybe a meeting to finalize a plan or exchange information.
Because remember, at this point, Ismail's supposed to be in town for sightseeing and business.
Right. The whole thing it stinks.
It does. Okay, so we've got these conflicting stories, suspicious encounters.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the AUA for a second. We know they weren't exactly fans of the patriarch, but did they have a real reason, a motive, to want him dead?
To understand that, you got to look at the bigger picture, the Assyrian community at the time.
Like their history, their struggles.
Exactly. So the Assyrian people, they have this long history of persecution, being forced from their homes. It's created this huge diaspora scattered all over the world.
Right.
And the AUA, they were all about Assyrian nationalism. They believed the only way to survive, to protect their culture, was to create their own independent state within Iraq.
Which, as we said earlier, the patriarch wasn't on board with. He thought it was too risky.
Right, too dangerous. And that put him in direct conflict with a lot of people in the AUA. They thought he was too weak, too willing to compromise.
So basically, a fundamental disagreement about the future of the Assyrian people.
Exactly. And this is all happening in the background of this case. And then there's the patriarch's decision to get married.
Yeah, that came up a lot in the transcripts. What was the big deal about that?
Well, for a lot of Assyrians, the patriarch wasn't just a religious leader. He represented their whole culture, their traditions.
Okay.
For centuries, The patriarch had always been a celibate monk. It was like a core part of their belief system. So when he decided to marry, it shook things up.
Created a divide in the church.
A huge divide. And that divide, it probably extended to the AUA too, right?
Yeah, definitely added fuel to the fire. Okay, so we have this mix of political and religious tension, all bubbling under the surface. It definitely adds another layer to all the testimonies and evidence we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And you got to keep that in mind when we talk about Ismail's mental state, which is what the defense was pushing hard.
Right, the psychological evaluations.
Yeah.
They brought in two psychiatrists, Dr. Rappaport and Dr. Niederver, and both of them suggested Ismail might have had a mental disability.
Yeah, and it's interesting. At first, Dr. Rappaport thought it was premeditated, the murder. But then he started digging into Ismail's medical history, and he wasn't so sure anymore.
What changed his mind?
Well, there was the brain damage from a previous injury, the blackouts, the possibility of amnesia brought on by alcohol.
So he was thinking maybe it wasn't planned after all.
Right. Maybe it was more of an impulsive thing triggered by, the patriarch supposedly insulting Ismail's father.
And what about Dr. Niederver?
He basically agreed. He said the alcohol could have made Ismail's mental state even worse, maybe to the point where he didn't even know what he was doing.
But the prosecution, I'm guessing they weren't buying any of this.
Not really. They kept pointing out these inconsistencies in Ismail's story, like how much did he really not remember? And then there's the fact that he bought a gun, traveled to the patriarch's house, ran away afterwards. All of that suggests some level of planning.
So both sides had their arguments, and both used the same facts to tell their story. It's like two completely different realities.
And in the end, the jury had to pick a side. And they went with the prosecution, guilty of first-degree murder.
But then somehow the mental disability plea comes into play and overturns their decision. Do the transcripts tell us how that happened?
Sadly, no. The details of his release, they're still fuzzy. It's like a piece of the puzzle is missing.
So frustrating. Was there something going on behind the scenes? Did someone with influence step in?
Yeah.
We may never know.
It really shows how, even with all these court documents, sometimes the truth is still hidden.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that things aren't always so black and white. But we're not done yet. There are still more people to talk about, more perspectives to consider.
Right, like Sam Andrews, the guy accused of being a spy, and Reverend Michael Burney, who had a very different view of the patriarch. We'll get into all that in the next part.
Man, we've gone deep on this case. The crime scene, the evidence, the conflicting stories, the politics of it all. It's like we keep peeling back these layers, and there's always another one underneath.
It's those layers, I think, that are really important. We can't look at this assassination as just one event. It's all tied up with the Assyrian community, their past, their struggles, everything.
Like trying to solve a puzzle without knowing what the picture's supposed to be.
Exactly. And remember Sam Andrews, accused of spying for Iraq along with Ismail's brother. His testimony, it brings in another whole level of complexity.
His story is wild, almost like something out of a spy movie. He swore he wasn't a spy, that he was just trying to help his people. But the fact that these accusations even existed, it tells you a lot about the atmosphere back then, all the suspicion.
It shows you the tough spot a lot of Assyrians were in, scattered all over the world, dealing with problems of loyalty, where they belonged, how to survive, torn between their homeland, which was often dangerous and oppressive, and their new country, where they were trying to build a life but also hold on to their heritage.
It's a hard balance to strike. And then there's Reverend Michael Burney, the priest who married the patriarch. He gave a completely different picture of him compared to other witnesses.
Yeah, his account is really important because he described the patriarch as a good man, a kind man, a real leader for his people, not at all like the controlling authoritarian figure some people made him out to be.
Makes you wonder if some of the anger towards the patriarch wasn't really about his actions, but about deeper anxieties in the community. Maybe his marriage, his stance on Assyrian nationalism, those just became symbols for all those unspoken anxiety.
That's a good point. You have to remember, the Assyrian people have been through so much hardship. Their diaspora is a testament to how strong they are, but it also comes with a lot of trauma and uncertainty. So something like the patriarch getting married, it could take on a whole different meaning, trigger strong emotions, and feed those ideological clashes.
So where does all this leave us? We've looked at the crime, the evidence, the motives, the history, the culture, and still there's this feeling that we don't have the full story.
And that's what's so fascinating about this case, isn't it? We have so much information, all those transcripts, testimonies, but the truth is still slippery.
David Malik Ismail, a convicted murderer walks free because of this mental disability plea that just raises more questions. And he never spoke about it publicly, so his version of events, his motives, any connections he might have had, it's all gone with him.
It's like we have this puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing. Maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. Justice and truth, they're not always clear-cut. There's always room for interpretation.
It definitely makes you think, makes you question everything, and realize that sometimes we just can't know for sure.
That's right. But the fact that we're even trying to figure it out, that we're digging into all these layers, confronting the difficult parts, that's important. It's about being honest and trying to understand.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you, our listeners, to keep digging. Go back to those source materials, look at the evidence, think about the different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions. This case, with all its twists and turns and unanswered questions, it really shows how powerful history is and how the stories we tell ourselves shape who we are. Thanks for being with us on this journey.